Hello, everybody. Good evening. I can see someone's already got their hand up for a question, which is fabulous. There will be time for questions as we roll through the next hour. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge that all of us are coming together from from the lands of Australia's First Nations people, and acknowledge that sovereignty of that land has never been ceded, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. And I'm sure all of you join me also in acknowledging the very rich contribution that our Indigenous people make to land management and biodiversity conservation, particularly in coming years when things get a little bit more challenging than they have been for us. It's a real pleasure tonight for me to introduce to all of you Dr. Daniella Teixeira. Daniella is a fabulous asset to the Glossy Black Conservancy that I am representing tonight. Actually, before I introduce Daniella, perhaps I should introduce myself, seeing I'm here talking. My name's Sam. I'm the coordinator for this year's Glossy Black-Cockatoo Birding Day, which happens on the 11th and 12th of September. Sadly, we had to postpone last year's Birding Day, which is the first year in 10 years that the Birding Day hasn't taken place, which means this year's Birding Day is even more crucial in terms of collecting data about Glossy Black-Cockatoos, especially on the back of recent bushfires. So we're really excited that so many of you could join us tonight for this webinar, and hopefully also on Birding Day as volunteers to count birds. So my job for Birding Day is to coordinate all of the logistics. Tonight, I'm going to introduce Dr. Danny and also help facilitate questions to Danny. We have more than 100 people registered tonight, and we already have 60 online. So rather than have you all ask questions directly to Danny, if you could ask those in the Q&A feature or in the chat feature, then I will help moderate those as the evening progresses, and Danny will remind you as she presents as well about that. So a little bit about Danny, the inimitable Danny. You will see that Danny has recently featured in a David Attenborough documentary. So she's our star here at the Conservancy, and we tend to roll her out for all sorts of important commitments like this one. But as well as being a documentary star, she's also a conservation scientist, and her research predominantly focuses on species monitoring, especially with a focus on improving conservation outcomes. She completed her PhD pretty close to where we're based on the Gold Coast at the University of Queensland, and through that process, she researched bioacoustic methods of monitoring breeding in Glossy Black-Cockatoos on Kangaroo Island, but also red-tailed black-cockatoos in Victoria. More recently, Danielle has been working on bushfire impacts to Glossy Black-Cockatoos. She's been doing acoustic monitoring of frogs and malleefowl, and through the National Malleefowl Recovery Team. She's been a member of the Conservancy, Glossy Black Conservancy, thankfully, for 5 years. She loves connecting with fellow glossy enthusiasts in Southeast Queensland, which is where she lives. And she also runs a couple of really popular social media channels across Facebook and Instagram, which hopefully she'll introduce us to, or at least give us the links to, as tonight progresses. So I'm going to hand over to Daniella. Remember, if you have questions, to hit the Q&A function here in Zoom, and we'll do our best to answer those. And enjoy the presentation. I'm going to slip into the background while Daniella does her thing. So hello, goodbye. Over to you, Danny.
Thanks, Sam. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully that's working. Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, Sam. And I'd also like to start out just by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I am based. So I live on the Southern Gold Coast, so Yugambeh country. And I'm really glad so many people could join tonight. And if you know the Indigenous land that you're on, feel free to put that in the chat and acknowledge those as well. So as Sam said, I'm Daniella Teixeira. On social media, you can find me at Black Cockatoo Project. So I actually only just finished my PhD about a year ago, so I'm pretty fresh out of the research space. But thankfully, I'm still working on Glossy Black-Cockatoos and a range of threatened species in various different roles. So if you follow me on social media, you'll see some of the things that I get up to. Tonight's not really about research, though. I'm just really going to be focusing on the stuff that you guys need to know if you're joining Birding Day, which I hope you are. So I'll start out just with a little bit of background about glossy black cockatoos. So there's actually 5 species of black cockatoo in Australia. So that's the glossy black cockatoo, of course, the red-tailed black cockatoo, the yellow-tailed black cockatoo, and then over in Western Australia, we've got Carnaby's cockatoo and Bodan's cockatoo. So those are the 5 species that are in the genus Calyptorhynchus. We've actually got a couple of other cockatoos that are black, like the palm cockatoo, for instance, but they're actually out in a separate genus. So we tend to not call them black cockatoos, but they're still black cockatoos. Just a little bit of taxonomy there for you. Glossies are the smallest black cockatoo and also the quietest, which is interesting because my research is actually in bioacoustics. So some people are a little bit confused why I went down the bioacoustics route for glossies, but it turns out that it is actually a really efficient method for monitoring their breeding. But in terms of what you think of cockatoos as being these very loud, raucous flocks. So if you think of like what defines a cockatoo, that's often what people will think of. Glossies really don't fit that bill. They're sort of out on their own in that sense. They tend to be in really small flocks and they tend to be pretty quiet. So there are actually 3 recognized subspecies of glossy black cockatoo. And on the map down the bottom, you can see where they roughly occur. So here in Southeast Queensland, we have subspecies Lathami, so Calyptorhynchus lathami, and that stretches all the way from sort of central southern Queensland down to northeast New South Wales, and northeast Victoria. And if you were paying attention to some of the media reports during the bushfires some 18 months ago, you know that some of those actually went all the way down to Melbourne, which is quite a range extension in response to those fires. So they are a threatened species in all of those states. Habitat loss and degradation is their main threat. And this is mostly because glossies are she oak specialists. So they only eat the seeds of she oak trees. And they eat a bunch of different species depending where in the country we're speaking about. So here in Southeast Queensland, there's sort of 2 main species that they feed on, but there's a couple of others the further west you go. But then somewhere like Kangaroo Island, there's actually only 1 species that they feed on, which is actually what you can see in that photo there. So the really, really big cones of the drooping she oak. Glossies have a really low reproductive output, which is another one of the things that makes them so vulnerable to extinction. So they actually have basically 1 egg, every 1 to 2 years roughly, which is very, very low for any species. And of those eggs that are actually laid, we think, in a good year, perhaps 50% survive to fledge. And then how many survive beyond that, we don't know. So, for all intents and purposes, they have a really low reproductive output, which means that any threats, really, they take a long time to recover from them. They're super vulnerable to extinction. Here in Southeast Queensland and Northern New South Wales, there's quite a lot we don't know. I would say there's far more that we don't know than what we do know about them here. So simple things like where do they occur, where do they move, where do they breed, and the big questions like the impacts of fire, drought, and of course climate change. These are really things that we don't have a handle on at this point. But some of this, Birding Day is really what helps us start to address some of the questions. So things like, where do they occur at this time of year? So we're coming up to the end of the breeding season now. So we should have, most of the birds have finished nesting. They might be starting to flock up in their larger flocks post-breeding. So where do they occur at this time of the year? That can tell us quite a lot. So by helping us on Birding Day, you can start to contribute to some of this knowledge. And then scientists like myself and others in the Conservancy, we can start to use some of that data in our actual research and build upon it. So it's really, really valuable, you guys going out there and helping us look for them. Most of what I'll talk about today, though, isn't their conservational research. Like I said, it's really about helping you guys with ID. We really, really rely on your confident ID of glossies. So I've done my best to sort of anticipate what you might struggle with some of the ID issues. But if you have any questions, and if I've missed something or glossed over it too much, please just put a question in the Q&A and I'll do my best to answer them. So these are the 3 species of black cockatoo that we'll see in this region. Sorry, that map is a little bit difficult to interpret, but basically the red box is the rough distribution of red-tailed black-cockatoos. The yellow boxes, squiggly lines, are the yellow-tailed distribution, and then the gray is glossies, which is a little bit inaccurate, but you get the point. So here in Southeast Queensland, we've got all three species of black cockatoo. So there is potential for some confusion. But really it's going to be yellowtails that you're most likely to see. So red-tailed black cockatoos, they do occur here, but it's very rare, especially if you're close to the coast like I am. And I personally haven't actually seen red-tailed black cockatoos down here before. So it's really going to be glossy black cockatoos and yellow-tailed black cockatoos that might cause a bit of confusion. But nonetheless, I'll go through the ID for all three species. So this is generally what they look like. These pictures are actually all males of each species. So you can see red tails and glossies, you know, room for confusion. They're both sort of generally all black and they have those solid red tail feathers. Yellow tails on the far left, you know, look pretty different, I think. They have yellow in their tails for one. And they have that really distinctive cheek patch that you can see there. So the main thing, like I said, is really getting your idea of those yellowtails separated from the glossies. So here's a closer up of a yellowtail that I took a little while ago. So I'll go through some key things to look for. So this is a male, and I know this because he's actually got pink around his eye. So the females don't have that pink. But generally yellowtails are all black or sort of like a browny black all over. And they really have, like I said, that distinctive yellow cheek patch. So if there's one thing to look for if you're confused, just look for that yellow cheek patch. It's the same for males and females. They're not very sexually dimorphic. The males and females look very, very similar. So just look for that one solid yellow cheek patch. Yellowtails also have a very distinctive call. So my research is in bioacoustics or their vocalizations. And I think that yellowtails have some of the most amazing calls of any black cockatoo. So I hope that, that the call will play for me. So hopefully you guys can hear this. Great, Sam's giving me the thumbs up. Excellent. Yeah, so if you hear that wailing kind of sound, that's going to be a yellowtail. There's nothing here that you might get that confused with. They sound similar to the Carnabies and the Bodans in WA because that's their closest relatives, but they're not here, so you don't have to worry about that. And in terms of their behavior, their ecology, yellowtails are quite different from glossies in that they do tend to occur in these larger, medium to large flocks. You will see pairs and trios as well, but if you do find them in, say, pine plantations or somewhere else with abundant food, they really will come together and exploit that in these big noisy flocks. It's quite incredible when you witness that, because the sound is like overwhelming. It's a true cacophony. Oh, there's the call again. I'll move on. And these are the red-tailed black-cockatoos. So like I said, you probably aren't going to see them here unless you're a little bit further west, but they do look most similar to glossies, at least the males do. So that's the male on the left there, and they are black all over. And like glossies, they have solid red in their tails, but there's many different ways that you can kind of tell red tails and glossies apart. And one of the things that's really characteristic on red tails is they have a very large crest. And you can see in this photo, both the male and the female have their crest up. So glossies do have a crest, but it's very, very small. The females look very different from the males, as you can see in this image, but they also look very different from glossy females, which I'll show you in a second. So red tail females is really, if you just were to see a photo and there's a pair sitting there, look at the female. That's how you definitely know that it's red tails and not glossies. So red tail females are absolutely beautiful, as you can see. This photo is actually taken at one of my study sites in Victoria, so it's not the same subspecies that we have here, but yeah, they have these beautiful spots all over them, and this striking banding all over their body, and their tail feathers have these black bars, so they're sort of red and orange, and they've got black stripes through them. So all of those spots all over the body, tiny little spots, that's how you can tell that it is a red tail. And in terms of their behavior, they do flock up in really large flocks. So again, similar to yellowtails, if they're somewhere with lots of food, you're going to see huge amounts of red tails coming together and squawking and carrying on, typical of a cockatoo. So I'll play their call for you. Great. Hopefully you can hear that. And then our lovely Glossy. So this is a photo by a friend of mine, Trevor Anderson. You can find him on Instagram at Australian Nature. So Glossies basically are all black or about browny black all over their bodies. So we've got the male here on the left. And as you can see, he doesn't really have any distinctive markings on his body, but he does have those solid red bands in his tails. And that's characteristic of an adult male. So if you see a bird that's black all over, solid red in the tail, that's going to be an adult male Glossy. And the female on the right there, she looks quite different to the male in that sense. She has this very random, haphazard, patchy yellow feathers on her head. So this female here, she's sort of just got it around her chin. We call it like a collar, but often it can be, you know, all the way across the head. Sometimes it's almost like there's not much else other than yellow on the head. But the females are actually quite variable in this sense. Some females have, yeah, like I said, quite a lot of yellow, and others have nearly none. So it's very, very variable between the individuals. And if you really wanted to pay attention to the birds that you're seeing, this pattern is actually distinct to the individual, a bit like our fingerprints. So you can actually start to track them through time. And if you take photos, you can actually get to know the Glossies that you monitor. And in terms of their behavior, like I said earlier, they tend to be in these smaller flocks. So usually when I'm out in the field, it's rare to come across more than a pair. Normally it's just the male and the female pair hanging out together. If it's post-breeding, like it will be during birding day, you might see a trio. So that's the pair and their dependent young. And then occasionally you'll see small flocks. So I'm thinking probably fewer than 10 individuals, something like that. The only time that I've really seen big flocks coming together, say 30 or more Glossies, is when they're coming down to drink in the late afternoon. If you come across a big flock in the forest, it's probably going to be late afternoon when they're moving to drink and then roost. And they do have a very distinct call, even though they're quiet. When they take off, when they fly, they do tend to give out a call. And they have a whole range of calls, which is what my research is focused on. But this is the main call that you will hear out in the forest. So yeah, that's basically the flight call / some contact calls in there. And the other sound that you'll hear is often their feeding, feeding calls. They give very soft, it's very easy to miss, but they give these very soft sort of growls when they're feeding, and that's just a way for them to stay in contact with one another. But you can actually also hear them cracking open the sheot cones as they're feeding. So you can just hear this like crack, crack, crunch, and that's often if you just stop, if you're in the forest, stop and just listen. That's often a way that you'll come across them. It's once you get your ear in for it, it can be hard at the start, but once you get your ear in, it's one of the best ways to actually find them out in the field. And I just put this photo in here just sort of as a, but wait, there's more. This is actually an adult female. So you could easily mistake this for a male because as you can see, there's, barely no yellow on her. But there's two key things here that tell me that this is a female. And to be fair, she probably was with a male as well nearby. So you could tell that there was another adult male. But if you just were seeing this photo, we can see there's a little fleck of yellow on her cheek there. That's not distinctive of females necessarily. Occasionally males will have a little fleck as well. So just, don't pay too much attention if there's not a lot of yellow on the face, but she's got a lot of yellow in her tail, and that is characteristic of females. So males, they might have some stripes in their tails if they're young, before they fully mature, that the young males will have some stripes, but they're not going to have this level of orange and yellow in their tails. It'll tend to be all red. So have a look for that, and I'll show you some some photos of the young males in a minute. And this is just a beautiful photo of a female showing all of those distinctive traits. So this female's got sort of more evenly spaced yellow on her head, and you can see those beautiful tail feathers all fanned out. And you can actually see, if you pay attention, this female's, the tail, the stripes in the tail are getting very, very thin. And that's actually a way to age them. So we won't go into the detail of that at the moment, but just know that if you see a female with nearly no stripes, it means she's pretty old actually. And this guide basically shows us that. So the male cockatoos will have solid red tails by the time they're 6-ish, and females will start to lose some of the stripes in their tail. All right, so this is what I was talking about with the juvenile / subadult males. And you might be thinking, why am I not talking about juvenile females? And the only reason basically is that we don't tend to see juvenile females by themselves. So females tend to get sort of snapped up by a male pretty quickly. So they're with their parents for a while, like 12 months or so, and then they're basically partnered up. And this is mostly coming from my experience on Kangaroo Island. We're not really sure what happens here, but assuming it's the same, there is actually a sex ratio bias at birth. So there's actually more males in the population than females. And so you tend to have some of these unpaired males kind of getting around together. And it's often these young males, and we sort of jokingly call them the bachelor flocks, and they can be quite large. I've seen bachelor flocks here in Southeast Queensland, and they've been upwards of probably 15 to 20 birds, and they're all of these young males. And we know that they're males because, like I said, they've got all red basically in their tails with these black stripes. So we know that this is definitely not a female bird. But as you can see, everything else on their body is starting to look just like an adult male. One of the really interesting behaviors that you might see is what we call display behavior. And in the context of nesting, we call it courtship behavior, but they give this very distinctive call. And it kind of goes, I'll try and mimic it for you. It kind of goes like, whoosh, 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 whoosh. It's quite soft, and they will give that, and then they fan their tail feathers out, and they will do that to each other as like a dominance display, and then the males will actually do it to their females as well once they're paired up in a courtship display, and that precedes copulation. So it's a really cool behavior if you actually if you get your ear in for it and can witness it. It's quite remarkable. But yeah, basically all I want to say with this is just look for the solid red with the black bars, and you'll be on your way to identifying those subadult males. And then the fledglings. So these are my favorite, of course. So these are the young ones. So they're still dependent on their parents. And you can see in this photo, they've sort of got bits and pieces of like male and female, and, you know, it can be a little bit confusing. So we're not expecting you to ID the sex of these birds. It would just be great if you could just identify that it's a fledgling. They have these really irregular spots and bands that tend to sort of fade over time, and, you know, they'll slowly start to develop their more adult plumage. And in this picture, I love this photo. This is what you'll tend to see. This is very typical. So you've got the male, adult male up the top right there, the adult female bottom left, and then the fledgling in the middle. And you can see the fledgling's got all of those spots all over its chest. That's characteristic of a young bird. And you can see mum and dad are happily feeding, and the little one's he's got a cone in his claw there, but, you know, maybe he's practicing how to feed, but probably doesn't really know how to feed itself much. So what you'll typically see in these situations is, you know, maybe the fledgling's having a go, probably not, you know, being all that successful at getting the seeds out. And will often be sort of clumsy, maybe flailing about because it's not very steady on the branches, and often will be begging like quite insistently. So you can just hear this like begging quite a lot. And sometimes you might actually see one of its parents feed it. So it is actually still dependent on its parents at this stage. And again, thinking of when birding day is going to be, it's in September. There's likely going to be very young fledglings, maybe maybe even super fresh out of the nest, perhaps up to 3 months old or so. So they're likely to still be dependent on their parents for some food. So you might see some begging behavior. So basically, if you're out there on the day, you see 3 birds, mum, dad, and fledgling, please note it down. We would love to know where the fledglings are going because, like I said, we know nearly nothing about their breeding behavior. All right, so that's it for the bird ID. Please pop your questions in the Q&A. I'm just going to flick over briefly to the feed tree ID. So this is also very important, slightly less important than bird ID though. So if you aren't super confident in your tree ID, that's okay. But I'll still run you through some of the main trees that you might see. So in this region, Southeast Queensland, Northern New South Wales, there's basically 2 main she oak species that you'll find glossies feeding on. And there on the bottom left, that's the black she oak, and on the right is the forest she oak. So it can be a little bit difficult until you're sort of out there and you can really pick up those cones and see how they're different. But once you notice the difference, it's actually quite easy to tell. There's some closer up images. So the black she oak up the top there, so that's Allocasuarina littoralis. It's got these sort of sharp, sort of, quite pointy cones. So if you pick it up, it can be quite spiky. Whereas the forest she oak, the torullosa, is sort of rounder. It's definitely not spiky like the littoralis is. And if you actually go up to the tree and have a look at its bark, it does have this very distinctive, like corky kind of look. So that's another way that you can tell. But generally, if you just basically go up to the tree and have a look at some of the cones, even the ones that are just on the floor, you can basically tell if it's littoralis or torullosa. So they're not only species that glossies will feed on, but I would say in my experience here in Southeast Queensland, it's probably 90% of the birds that I found have been feeding on these 2 species. And that's sort of generally what they look like. It's kind of hard to tell from these images. They probably look really similar at this angle, but yeah, just have a look for the differences in the cones. Here's another, good close-up. You can actually see those, the closer up images of the cones that have opened. So that's actually after they've released their seeds. So the 2 sort of top images, if you can call them that, they're on the tree and they're still closed. The bottom images are dried out cones that have actually released all the seeds. So it's actually the seeds that the glossies eat, or actually the kernels within the seeds. So glossies are just so specialized. You might have heard that they're the fussiest parrot, which is probably completely true, because they're fussy not just down to the individual tree, but sometimes the individual cones within a tree. And there's a range of reasons why that relate to nutrition and a range of other things. But yeah, extremely fussy. Like I said, 90% of the time, you'll probably see them feeding on only these 2 species of she oak. And then the other species that you do sometimes see them feed on around here is Casuarina equisetifolia. So that's the horsetail she oak or the coastal she oak. So you see this around northern New South Wales, sometimes around the Sunshine Coast as well. So this type of she oak is really loyal to basically the coastal areas, so sandy dunes essentially. And you'll also find a range of other species feeding on these as well. So sometimes if you see chewings, which we'll discuss in a second, it might not be glossies. So it can sometimes be a little bit difficult to ID. But basically, have a look, if you're near the coast, have a look underneath the coastal she oaks. You might sometimes see glossies, but probably not all that often. And this is what I was saying with the chewings, the feeding evidence is really distinctive. So if you're in the forest, particularly under a forest she oak or a black she oak, and if glossies have been feeding on it, you'll really see this distinctive, it's almost like sawdust, I suppose, underneath the trees. If a lot of birds have been feeding on a tree, or have been feeding on there for quite a few days or weeks, they tend to strip most of the good high quality cones off the tree, and they'll chew them, and all the little bits of cone and seed and whatnot fall to the ground, and they leave this sort of like distinct mat underneath the tree. And again, like once you get your eye in, it's pretty obvious. At first, I remember when I started working on glossies, I just thought, how would you ever see that? And now I can't not see it if I'm out walking and I see chewings, even if they're old and like decaying, it's still really distinctive to my eye. And this is sort of what it looks like. I've got a pen there in that image just for a bit of scale. The colors, I think I should have said that on this slide. So the color is actually indicative of the age. So based on when those cones were chewed. So the fresher that it is, the lighter in color it is. So if you actually go to a tree where glossies are eating right that moment, it's going to be this like really sort of green, creamy kind of color. And as it ages, it gets darker orange and then eventually sort of gray. So in these images, these are chewings I found up in Springbrook National Park. And they're, that sort of medium orange kind of color. So I would say that they're fresh, sort of probably within the last month or so, but they're not fresh like today fresh. But certainly they've been using that area in the last few months. And in this particular case, that was really important for me to know because I was doing some bushfire surveys, and it was great to know that the birds had been there since the bushfires. All right, so that's it for ID. I'm just going to quickly go through the data sheets. So if you've signed up, you would have been sent some data sheets and hopefully some survey locations and some protocols. I'm not a regional coordinator, so I'm not exactly sure what everybody has been sent, but I'll just, for the sake of this evening, I'll just kind of step through some of the main things. So basically, the survey protocol is very, do what you will, do what you can manage. We're really grateful for people just to go out and even just look for chewings and feed trees. Even that would be enough. Like I said, if you can't ID the species of feed tree, don't worry about it. Just note its location, and that's pretty good. We can always go back and look at the species of tree at a later date. But basically, find a place that you like, that's accessible to you, that's safe. Spend as much time as you want walking around, listening, going to watering spots if it's late in the day, or walking through the feeding habitat. Take breaks when you need. Don't feel obliged to stay out for the whole day. There's no need for that. Generally, glossies will pretty much, not always, but pretty much will stay in the same general area for most of the day. So you're probably not going to have to sort of move around and try and chase them across the landscape. You can cover a patch thoroughly in a couple of hours. Some tips. So take lots of photos and videos if you can. Photos would be great if you need help, say, identifying the sex and age of the bird. You can send them to us, send them to me, email me or DM me on social media. I can help you ID them. And if you're really confused about if it even is a glossy, take a video. We don't need to actually see the bird. If we can just hear the sound, then we can help you confirm whether or not it is actually a glossy. So sometimes people will send me these really far away iPhone photos, and I can't really see. But if I just say, please just take a 5-second video clip, send it to me, and I can instantly tell you if it is a glossy or not. Another thing that I tend to do, which, take it or leave it, but when I find a feed tree or I find birds, I just tend to take a quick photo on my iPhone just so that it geotags the location, and then I can get my GPS location out of the photo later. I don't tend to worry when I'm in the field about getting my lats and longs straight away. I just find it easier to take a quick photo or a pin on Google Maps. That's just me personally. Do whatever you like, but please get as precise location information as possible. That really helps us in doing our analyses later on. So this is what the data sheets look like. So I'll just really run you through this. I just sort of mocked it up as if it were me going out there. I just went out in the afternoon. It's really important that you put the names or initials of everybody who went out, because it's important for us to understand how many people were out there as sort of like a survey effort metric. So if you can, one person going out by themselves is probably less likely to find the birds than, say, a group of 5 or 10 people. So if you could please just put the names or initials of everyone, that would be excellent. A map grid reference. So depending where you are, you may or may not get this from your regional coordinator. But the main thing here is that it's one data sheet per grid cell. So if you are planning on going out to 2 different grid cells during the day, please change over your data sheets when you move location, just so we can be very clear where your data has come from. And as Sam has written here in big bold letters, a 0 result is still a result. And I cannot stress that enough. If you go out and you didn't find glossies, please still fill out this first page. And this section that asks, did you find glossies at this location? Please just circle no. It's really important for us to get where they're not. It's just as important to get where they're not as where they are. Where they're not can tell us so many things. So please, 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 if you don't see any birds, tell us where you looked for them. We've also got a question here. Did you find feed trees? So even if you didn't find birds, but you did find some chewings, please let us know as well. It'd be great if you could just explain also the survey conditions. If it's super windy, it can be sometimes hard to find them. So again, it's just a good way for us to kind of gauge how likely you were to actually find them. So this is what you fill out if you do find glossies. So this first section, hopefully it makes intuitive sense. We kind of ummed and ahed about on the design of this a little bit, and it's different if you've been involved in birding days over the past 10 years. You'll notice that this is quite different, but basically it's the same information. It's actually less information this time to make it a little bit easier for you. So basically, as an example here, I've got 3 different groups of birds. So I've got group 1, group 2, group 3, and 6 birds total that I saw. So in group 1, we've got birds 1, 2, and 3, and that was an adult male, an adult female, and a fledgling. I don't know the sex of the fledgling, but that's fine. I've just ticked fledgling. And I've got here that the adults both were feeding, and the juvenile, or the fledgling rather, the dependent fledgling, was begging. So that's pretty typical what you might see if you come across 3 birds. I've noted the time that I saw them at 1:21 p.m. And I've written here that I've got GPS from this photo, and I've written the photo image there. And later on when I get home, I'm going to write down my lats and longs. Bird group number 2 was just a flyover. You know, I didn't actually see the bird, but I heard it. I heard it call and go overhead. It was in the distance, so I don't know the age or sex, but I heard it was definitely flying over. And I noted the location where I heard it. And then in group number 3, I've got an adult male, an adult female, and they were coming in to drink on sunset. And I've noted here that it's the waterhole in Smith Park, which I'll then probably grab my Google pin and note that down and put my lats and longs in there. And then this is what you fill out if you come across feed trees. So there's been some confusion in the past, what is a feed tree? And it's not just any sheoak. I mean, you couldn't record data from every single sheoak that you came across, which is when I first did birding day some 5 years ago, I was like, do I need to fill out data from every single feed tree? But no, what we mean in this case with a feed tree is a tree that has chewings or orts underneath it, or where you actually have seen the birds feeding. So literally a tree that the birds have fed on, not a potential feed tree. So again, we collect as much information as we can. If you don't know the tree species, please, that's totally fine. Just put unknown. In this case, that first group of birds, if I just flick back, this first group number 1, birds 1, 2, and 3, they were feeding. So here we've got birds 1, 2, and 3. So I'm referring to that particular group of birds that I saw. They were feeding in a forest sheoak. And because they were actively feeding, of course, the chewings are going to be whitish green because they're fresh. In terms of the location, I've referred back to table 1. Please see my iPhone image with the GPS locations. All of the others are feed trees that I found, but didn't actually see any birds, but that's fine. This is extremely valuable information nonetheless. Most of them were a forest sheoak, and later on I went down to the beach, saw some chewings under a coastal sheoak, or the horsetail sheoak, it's also called. And then I also found some chewings under a black sheoak. One of the forest sheoaks, again, was pretty fresh. It's whitish green, but under the other 2 trees, it was sort of older, that darkish orange, similar to the photo that I showed you earlier. So I've just got brown to dark orange tick there. Again, a GPS from a photo. That's just, again, my personal preference. Please feel free to do that however you want and makes sense to you. And then just to sort of wrap it up, a bit of OH&S, please just be sensible out there. Make sure you follow all of your COVID restrictions. Please wear some good shoes, of course, all the usual hats and sunscreens and water and lunch. Snake bite kit is important, never leave home without one. Camera, if you have one, is excellent. Binoculars, all of that, and take as many data sheets as you need. They've been designed so that you can just print lots and lots of copies of them. And once you're done, you can send your data sheets to your regional coordinator or straight to Guy Castley at Griffith. So Guy is going to be responsible for inputting all of the data. Or I think this year there's actually an option for you to do that yourself on the website. I think Sam will talk about that. But yeah, that's basically it for me. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Danny. And thank you for everyone who's dropped some great questions into the Q&A function. Just to give Danny a little bit of a breather, I have popped the volunteer field data sheet into the chat function there. So if anyone was so excited by Dr. Danny's rundown of the data sheet, which took many, many hours for our Conservancy members to agree on, then that is there for you. But a hard copy will be posted to anyone who's registered as a volunteer and has given us their postal address. And it will be emailed to anyone who hasn't given us their postal address and instead has given us their email address. We're asking you to return data by the 17th of September. Obviously, we are a small conservancy. We don't have a lot of resources. We have a person for 1 week who is going to enter this data for us, and we want to maximize their time. So if you can get us your data sheets by the 17th of September, that means one of us poor suckers won't have to do that. And there are heaps of options for how you return those data sheets. You can pop them in the post, you can send a photo and email them, you can enter the data yourself into a Google Sheet. It's all outlined there in the data sheet that you'll receive later. A couple of other things. I wanted to acknowledge that we've got a few Conservancy members who have tuned into this webinar, brush up on their Glossy Black-Cockatoo ID skills. So I just wanted to acknowledge Eric Anderson from BirdLife Southern Queensland, who is up in the Sunshine Coast hinterland. We've got Lyndall Rosevier from Logan City Council, Ben Green from Sunshine Coast Council, Marima Hopkins from Tweed Council, and Catherine Madden from Scenic Rim. So hey, you all, and thank you for tuning in. Some of the questions and also in the chat are not related to bird ID and behaviour. If we have time to answer those after the bird ID related questions, we will come to them. But I do apologise if we run out of time tonight, because we do want to wrap up at 7 o'clock. For those who have other things to do. And on that topic, Spencer has just shared with us in the chat some of the threats that most of us probably know about related to Sunshine Beach and some potential habitat clearing that's going to go down there. We could talk about that all night, but I just wanted to share with you that they do have a petition if you'd like to find out more at change.org/saveourglossies. So Danny, are you ready for some questions? Yep.
Yep. I'm here.
Okay, so we've got a question from Lynn. Where do glossies make their nests?
Oh, great question. Nesting is my favorite topic. It's what I did my thesis on, so I could talk about nesting all day. So glossies need really large hollow bearing trees. So think of your big gum trees. They basically, think of like the oldest, biggest trees in the landscape. So the nests have to be very, very high. Sometimes 10, 20, 30 meters even, very, very high and quite big, deep hollows. Because if you think of a cockatoo, they're pretty big birds. So there has to be enough space in there for the nestling, as well as the mum to go in. So every single night, the mum bird will go in and sit with her nestling overnight. But in terms of where do they nest in the landscape, we don't know. So I've found a couple of nests in Southeast Queensland through a lot of effort, a lot of searching, but yeah, we still have very, very limited idea of where they actually nest and why they choose to nest where they nest, and we have zero idea of success rates. But what we do know from Kangaroo Island is that they tend to reuse the same nests year after year. So we often get the same, it can even be the same birds in the very next year using the same nests. again and again and again. So they are sort of loyal to their areas. They probably, from what we know on Kangaroo Island, will stick to generally the same area for breeding. There's some indication that birds will stick to the place that they were born in generally as well. So they have sort of like a flock region. They might not move too far away, particularly the females. But yeah, here in Southeast Queensland, Northern New South Wales, very limited idea. There's not many nest records at all.
Thanks, Danny. I think you also answered Rhonda's question because she wanted to know whether they had distinctive breeding areas or regions. Eric had a question, and that is related to the colour of beaks. So is that a useful indicator of sex?
I know that this is a thing in cockatoos. Maybe I don't pay enough attention. I'm not sure. I haven't really noticed that all that much. It's definitely the case in red-tailed black cockatoos. So in red tails, it's very, very distinctive. The females have this very ivory colored bill and the males have a very dark colored bill. I don't know if it's such a thing with glossies. Maybe somebody could chime in and prove me wrong, but yeah, I haven't noticed it nearly as much as I notice it with the red tails.
Yeah, if any of our other Conservancy members want to add to that, just put your hand up and I'll add you to this conversation. So Rosalie has a great question. When you see chewings or orts, do we know that they're specific to glossy blacks or could they be from other cockatoos?
Yeah, good question. So with the coastal she-oaks, like I said, you do tend to see a lot of other birds feeding on them. And I often, when I see that, I go up and I have a look at the chewing so I can kind of get an idea of the shape of the chewings. So it's a little bit tricky, but most of the time, and I'm generalizing here, this is me not being a very strict scientist, most of the time it will be glossies, and it tends to be sort of like the little end of the disc, we call it, like the way they eat the cone. If you think of the way they kind of break off the cone and then they sort of chew it from top to bottom, the bit that falls to the ground tends to be the end bit. You can actually see that it's sort of like the round disc, whereas some of the other birds like rosellas, for instance, they tend to eat around the middle and leave this sort of apple core shape. So if you see that, it's probably not glossies. The other thing is glossies tend to really eat a lot of the cones on the tree. So if they're high quality, they really will come back and eat that. So you see a lot of chewings all at once. You might not see that with some other parrots. So yeah, it's sometimes can be a little bit tricky, but just look for the shape, really, that round disc.
Thanks, Danny. Kind of connected to the subject of orts, and that is Liz wants to know what the difference is between feeding and allo feeding.
Oh, great question. Yeah, so that's on the data sheet. And I don't know if we ended up putting a note on the data sheet. We probably have. So
we did.
Oh, we did.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So feeding is feeding itself, and allo feeding is when a bird feeds another bird. So when they're at nests, you'll see the female feeding the nestling. So then the male never feeds the nestling, it's only the female. But then after it's fledged, after it's left the nest, you'll often see the male feeding the fledgling. And it will sort of bob its head and regurgitate its food and then, do the whole thing and allo feed the other bird. Interestingly, glossies don't actually make a sound when that's happening. So some other cockatoos, if you're really observant, you might see them do that and they make this weird kind of grunting sound as they regurgitate. Glossies don't do that, so it's a silent affair. But yeah, it's basically the regurgitation into the other bird's mouth.
Thanks, Danny. Harry's got a great question, and that is how critical or is a permanent water source to breeding site selection?
So water source is critical, absolutely critical. So we know that water has to be pretty much like, if possible, like right near the nest. Like if there's a dam or a trough even, that's ideal for nesting. But they will use water sources that aren't permanent as well. So sometimes after heavy rain, not such a thing here in Queensland where our wet season is summer, but on Kangaroo Island where the wet season is over the nesting period, they'll kind of use puddles on the side of the road and all sorts of water sources. But yeah, water near nests is absolutely critical. You're never going to find a nest where there's no water.
Thank you. Lyndall has a question. She's lucky enough to have glossies that hang out at her place. She's seen 4
great.
feeding on forest she oaks there in July, and the chewed cones quite woody and orangey. But she wants to know regarding nesting with large dead trees with big hollows. She's seen a lace monitor and wants to know if they could be a predator of glossies.
It's an excellent question. And I think they definitely could be. I would have no doubt that that would happen. There's just unfortunately no evidence that because we don't know anything about nesting. We have very, very little knowledge. On Kangaroo Island, I should have mentioned this earlier, where we've monitored literally hundreds and hundreds of nests every single year. The main cause of nest failure is possum predation. Which is why Kangaroo Island spends so much time protecting the nests from possums with the iron collars on the trees. But yeah, I have no doubt that the monitors, pythons, all sorts of things could get into the nest trees. But it sort of goes into some of those ecological questions about why some places seem to be more vulnerable to predation. So at least the nests that I've monitored here in Queensland, I've had none fail from predation, but they're a very different nest or very different landscape to what we deal with on Kangaroo Island. And I think this is a hypothesis, but I think having these dead trees in, say, remnant forests, like in national parks, where you've got, quite a healthy ecosystem, they might kind of have a better balance with the predators and preys. Whereas on Kangaroo Island, you have a huge overabundance of possums and other species. So yeah, it's unknown, but highly likely, I would say.
Which kind of leads to another question about nest boxes. Richard wants to know, he's based on the Sunshine Coast, if nest boxes are used with any success.
Oh, excellent question.
I know you're passionate about this one.
We get
Danny.
so many questions about nest boxes. And the thing is, on Kangaroo Island, they've literally deployed hundreds of nest boxes. And it's been one of the most important things that they've done to recover that subspecies. The birds use them, sometimes almost immediately. They put them up and the birds are using them because they've in the 90s, they did a bit of work and found that there was a real shortage of nesting hollows on the island through land clearing. But here, I'm not so sure. It's certainly not, it's not a design problem. It's not that the glossies can't use them, especially if we've tested the design on Kangaroo Island glossies, but also other black cockatoos, carnabes, bodans, red tails. The yellow tails will even use the glossies boxes. So they're all, it's certainly not a design feature or design flaw, but we've had very, very limited success here in Southeast Queensland with them using it. In fact, I don't know if we've ever had a confirmed nesting or confirmed nest success in a box here. And that's probably more likely to do with the landscape, whether or not there's actually a shortage of hollows or not, but also because we don't really understand why they choose to nest where they do, we don't have a good idea of how to place them in the landscape to sort of maximize the return on investment, so to speak. We kind of just put them out a bit haphazardly and hope for the best. So hopefully one day, as we kind of start to research this stuff more, we can actually make some better decisions around where we really need them to maximize breeding output. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. I hope that answered that question. Is it known, this is a question from Michelle, how far glossies will travel to find suitable feed trees?
Yeah, well, sort of. So when they're nesting, they tend to go for the best quality trees that are closest to the nests, which makes perfect sense, of course. Being such a specialized species and these seeds being sort of difficult to extract and feed on, they want to conserve their energy and go for the things that are closest to them. But if the food quality is poor, so if the trees are very old, they will skip those trees and they will move on further. And we estimate, this is again on Kangaroo Island, they estimate it's sort of a maximum of 12 kilometers in a day. But we haven't looked at that whatsoever here in Queensland. So again, don't know. But they're remarkable birds in that sense. We know, I mentioned earlier about the random birds that turned up in Melbourne after the bushfires. The fact that they can travel that far The fact that most birds survive the fires on Kangaroo Island shows how far they can fly. So they're very, very capable. So it wouldn't surprise me at all that they would do whatever they can to get the best quality food.
So just a comment here from Catherine, who's the Land for Wildlife Officer at Scenic Rim Council. G'day, Catherine. She just wanted to let everyone know, especially if you're in Scenic Rim, that they're hoping to do some pilot projects in post-fire areas using nest boxes. So go Scenic Rim. And also Marima from Tweed has just stressed that Casuarina equisitifolia is very important, commonly used by glossies on the Tweed coast, as Danny said.
That's true. Yeah,
coastal species. Yeah. This might be a little bit of a nerdy question, because we did say that Danny specialised in acoustic monitoring, and Martin would like to know whether you use AI to process long audio recordings from the bush in order to identify glossies, like Callan Alexander from QUT does with owls.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's what I do. That's pretty much my research. So I spent a good chunk of the last 5 years of my life developing AI methods to effectively scan those sound recordings and find glossies. Still have a bit of trouble with mix-ups with other cockatoos. They kind of look similar on a spectrogram, which is how we visualize sound files. But it certainly makes the method much more efficient than if we had to sift through it manually. And if you want to get super nerdy, I'm hopefully going to have that published very, very soon. It's just about to be submitted. And then I'm happy to talk AI all day and all night.
Maybe we should have a separate webinar for all things acoustics monitoring, and for those that are interested. Another question from Martin, which I think is useful to answer. He wants to know, I guess, why we're focusing on glossy black cockatoos instead of other black cockatoos. He wanted to ask, is there any value in keeping a record of other black cockatoos that are seen during birding day? So can you explain why we're honing in on glossy black cockatoos, Danny?
The only good reason I have is that because we're the Glossy Black Conservancy. To be fair, yellowtails are not a listed threatened species here. Neither are redtails. So redtails are threatened in other parts of the country. They're not here, but I do have concerns with both of those species. So I would say, there's always value, but the Glossy Black Conservancy isn't going to be collecting that data. But if you do see them and contribute that to the Atlas of Living Australia or BirdLife's bird data, that's super useful. Monitoring the common species is actually really important in this, if we start thinking long-term data sets, which is going to become increasingly important when we start to look at things like climate change. So definitely bring it on. Bring on the yellowtails. We need to study yellowtails more in this place, I think.
Dr. Daniella is very passionate about all black cockatoos. She's not cockatooist, I just have to say, not black cockatooist. All black cockatoos created equal in her eyes. A really important question from Beck. She asked it very early in this presentation, actually. We've said that not a lot is known about these birds, but Beck's wondering if there's any Indigenous knowledge that we could tap into. Do you know, Danny, if Indigenous groups have been engaged around this?
It's an excellent question. And to be honest, I don't think we've done nearly enough work in that space. So, black cockatoos have a lot of cultural significance in many places, but I don't think we've actually tapped into it in a management or scientific sense. But it's an excellent question. And I would love to see, us go down that path, definitely.
Yeah, and I've just made a note to Beck that, there are a lot of Conservancy members on this webinar, as we said, so we'll make a point of raising it at a future meeting to see if that's something that we can facilitate accessing some traditional knowledge in that space. So another question. Oh, no, just a comment from Margaret saying Wilson's Creek Huon Brook Landcare has been funded to install 24 artificial hollows on the top of Cunium Range in Byron Shire. Professor Sarah Legg is the scientific advisor, so they're trialling cockatubes, PVC hollows and wooden nest boxes. So awesome job, you guys. Danika's also made an observation related to Sunrise Beach. The glossies there will call for glossies in the areas that have the tallest trees. So they could be Melaleuca or blue gums, for example. Do we know whether it's important for glossy black cockatoos to have these higher trees?
That's really observant of you, Danica. I think I know exactly what you're saying. I think it probably is important, but I reckon it's something that's pretty localized, because there's plenty of places that you don't see that behavior as well. So, Kangaroo Island's a good example. It's a very different habitat and they don't really do that there. So I don't know. I'm not sure about the importance of it. I think it's a learned localized behavior personally, but one of those things to pay attention to. If you do see that though, note it down on your data sheet, because I'd be curious.
And you could also send us an email as well outside of this, and we can try and follow up. So Spencer also asked this question quite early on. What's the difference between remnant vegetation and remnant regrowth? Why is remnant regrowth protected? I think that's what he's asking.
Great question. Hi, Spencer. Yeah, well, so remnant vegetation is basically vegetation that's remnant, that hasn't been cleared, essentially. Ideally, that's what we are protecting. That's what we need, what glossies basically need. Regrowth is essentially stuff that's come back after a disturbance, after clearing, or with an offset, for instance. And it's not quite the same thing. So there's a few aspects to this issue, but she oaks, for one thing, are pretty tolerant of disturbance, so to speak, compared to some other species. They can handle things like fire, and they can do pretty well with plantings, for instance. So there's a lot we can actually do to kind of bolster feeding habitat. But it takes a long time for trees to sort of come back online, so to speak, for glossies. So what we don't want is a uniform stand of she oaks of all the same age, because then you're going to have not much happening for the first 10 years at least. Then suddenly you're going to have this boom system where they're producing a lot of cones. If they're in the right environment, that's key. They might not be on the right soil types, but if they are, which has been done in places like Kangaroo Island, you're going to have this boom for a few decades perhaps. There'll be a time where the production peaks, then it's going to decline very quickly. So she oaks are short-lived species compared to eucalypts and stuff. They don't tend to live very long, and really post 25 years, 30 years, maybe a bit older in some species, they're not really going to be producing cones. And what we're seeing in some places is these old stands of regrowth that sometimes might have been offset, sometimes might have just been planted or regrown naturally. They look like these big dense she oak forests, but they're actually producing no food. Or if they are producing food, there's barely any seeds inside the cones. So it's this sort of like false sense of security that's not actually providing any habitat for them. So yeah, essentially what we need is remnant vegetation. We need a mosaic of age classes. We need some young trees, some old trees, some fire, but not too much fire. It's getting that balance right. That's really what's important across the landscape, and don't think too locally, really think about how the birds will use a full landscape, which again, we don't know much about how the birds move in this area, but they're probably one large population. So we really want to understand how they use all of the different patches of habitat. Yeah, I hope that kind of gets at the question.
Thanks, Danny. And Danica, you asked a question earlier, just in case you didn't see it in the chat. Marima has just said that she's one of our Conservancy members from the Tweed, says that she thinks that those tall signal trees are critical for lots of species, that birds use them in the landscape for roosting, social behaviour and other things. So hopefully that contributes to your knowledge. Okay, so this question is kind of connected to what you were just saying, Danny, about managing landscape on more than a localized kind of, with more than a localized focus. So it is connected to Sunshine Beach. I left this to last. Look, the Conservancy doesn't have a position on the issue of clearing this particular piece of habitat, because we do have members that include local governments across Southeast Queensland. However, Dr. Danny may have a personal perspective on this. Should we be allowing the clearing of this Alocasuarina habitat in Sunshine Beach, especially seeing we don't know much about movement and breeding of these birds?
Look,
personal perspective.
Yeah, absolutely, personal perspective. And these are really, really tricky situations. Absolutely, in an ideal world, we should not be allowing this. We've got a seriously threatened species that has had huge impacts from recent fires, from a range of things, land clearing being one of the main issues. But let's just take a step back and think about what I've said all along, is that we don't know much about the birds here. So how can we even start to gauge what impacts these sorts of events might be having? And really, it's sort of a death by 1,000 cuts. It's a little bit of habitat here, a little bit of habitat there, one nest tree there, one nest tree over there. But how does that actually affect the broader population? We know that once they find a patch of feeding habitat or nesting habitat that is suitable quality, they will come back year after year after year, and that can become really important to those birds. Losing one of those might be far more consequential for those birds than, say, an equivalent, in our eyes, patch of habitat somewhere else that, for whatever reason, isn't actually offering them much habitat. And I can think of an example like right here where I live, in the southern Gold Coast. There's she oak right here, like literally in my backyard. The glossies don't use it because there's other things that make it not suitable for them. So it's actually not a habitat that's available to them. We can't just look at how much habitat is there spatially. We have to think about all the different things that make it habitat that they can actually use. So something like Sunshine Beach, where, there's habitat that we really, have excellent data for, probably the best data that we would have in Southeast Queensland, I would say, because there's such a wonderful community out there, monitoring them all the time. Yeah, it's going to be a serious misfortune to the birds, no doubt about it.
Thanks, Danny. Look, the Conservancy is really conscious of this issue and how hard people around Sunshine Beach and further afield are fighting to protect this habitat. So I'll just say again, if you want to learn more about that issue and add your voice to that campaign, change.org/saveourglossies for those guys. There are a couple more questions in the chat, but I think we're going to leave it there. I'm going to ask Dr. Danny to answer these questions, and we're going to, there's just 3 easy questions, Danny. We're going to pop them in our next e-news or on our Facebook page to answer them for you all. So don't think that we have ignored your question. I'm just conscious that it being a Monday night, people are probably keen to wrap up, and we have lost about 20 people in the last 15 minutes. They probably have children like me that are demanding to be fed. So did you want to say anything in wrapping up, Danny?
No, just thanks so much for tuning in. And yeah, please take, lots of photos on Birding Day and tag the Conservancy on social media and tag me at Black Cockatoo Project. I'd love to see.
Yeah, obviously, this training is leading up to Birding Day, and that's what we are trying to recruit you all for, to help us gather data. When issues like this Sunshine Beach issue arise, some of the best ammunition we can have as community campaigners is to have scientific data that backs up our arguments, and there's no doubt that exists for Sunshine Beach. But obviously we also want to make sure that we have data that encompasses all known glossy black habitat, feed trees, that we understand their behaviour, that we know what the impacts of bushfires have been on the birds as well. So your contribution on the 11th and 12th of September is hugely valuable to us. For those that are in a position to do so, you might have seen in our email newsletter that came out this morning, the Glossy Black-Cockatoo is being considered for inclusion in the EPBC Act, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. Both the Kangaroo Island subspecies and the Southeast Australia subspecies. Danny, did I get that right?
Southeast subspecies.
Southeast subspecies. So if you are passionate about protecting this species, commenting on that, comments close on the 28th of August are also critical. Please check out our website or email newsletter to do that. Thank you all once again for joining us. Thanks to our Conservancy members who've jumped online as well. We really appreciate your time, and we're looking forward to seeing you out in the field on the 11th and 12th. Thank you so much, Dr. Danny, for your time as well.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everyone.
See you all. See ya. This recording will be available if you would like to watch back at your convenience. So good night. See you soon. Bye.